Okay, imagine this. You're playing a game, you followed every single rule to the letter, and you are literally one move away from winning. And then, right at that last second, somebody yanks the rule book away and slams a completely new one on the table. Well, that's pretty much what happened to a company called Gold Creek Mining, and it kicked off one heck of a legal fight.
This whole case it just boils down to this one fascinating question. What happens when a brand new, nation-defining law just smashes right into promises that were made under the old system? I mean, who wins when the very ground beneath your feet legally shifts?
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to follow the story right from the beginning, from Gold Creek's first claim to the massive constitutional shakeup, through the whole legal showdown, the court's kind of brilliant solution, and finally, why a case this old still matters so much today. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, first things first. Let's meet our main player, the Gold Creek Mining Corporation. Now, these guys were operating in a time when the rules for mining were, totally clear.
See, back in the 1920s and 30s, the whole system was set up by a U.S. Congress Act from way back in 1902. The path for a prospector was really straightforward. Find some valuable minerals on public land, follow a clear set of steps, and eventually you could get what's called a patent, which is basically the final title deed from the government.
And Gold Creek, well, they were textbook. In 1929, they located and registered their claim. By 1934, they'd spent over 1,600 pesos, and trust me, that was a lot of money back then, on improvements and had the land officially surveyed. They filed every single piece of paperwork before 1935. They were right there at the very last stage. The only things left were a standard 60-day public notice and making the final payment. They were at the finish line.
And then, bam, the entire game changed. A new nation was being forged, and that meant a completely new rule book was about to drop.
For decades, everyone operated under that 1902 U.S. Act. But on November 15, 1935, the new Philippine Constitution went into effect. This wasn't just a new law, it was a new government, a new commonwealth, a whole new legal reality.
And buried inside that new constitution was this absolute bombshell of a clause. It said all natural resources belonged to the state, and, this is the key part, they could not be alienated. That's a legal term that just means they can't be sold or given away to private owners. All of a sudden, the government's stance was, sorry, we literally can't sell you that land. The new constitution says so.
So this, as you can imagine, set the stage for an epic legal showdown that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was a classic fight, a company's hard-earned right versus the new state's constitutional duty.
So on one side, you have Gold Creek saying, hey, we did everything you asked. Our right to this land is vested. It's locked in. You can't take it away now. But the government fired back saying, look, the Constitution is the highest law in the land, period. Our number one job now is to protect the nation's resources, and that means we can't sell you this mineral land. It was a total deadlock between two really powerful legal ideas. Who was right?
And this is where things get really interesting, because the Supreme Court had to thread a very, very fine needle. They needed a way to solve this without just crushing one side or the other.
The justices, in a moment of real genius, boiled this entire mess down to one single question. Was Gold Creek's mining claim still technically part of the public domain on that fateful day, November 15, 1935, when the Constitution came into power? Everything hinged on the answer to that.
And the court's answer? A simple, direct no. The land was not public domain anymore.
So you're probably asking, how in the world did they get there? Well, the court introduced this really clever legal idea called segregation from the public domain. They said that under the old law, the second Gold Creek did everything it was supposed to do to perfect its claim. That piece of land was legally separated from all the other public land. From that moment on, the government wasn't the real owner anymore. It was just holding the title in trust, kind of like a placeholder for Gold Creek.
And that was the masterstroke. Because if the land wasn't technically public domain when the new Constitution kicked in, then the Constitution's new rule against selling public resources, well, it just didn't apply to this specific piece of land. It was a brilliant way to respect the new Constitution and the rights that Gold Creek had already earned.
But hey, don't think for a second this was some easy, open and shut case. The justices themselves were split on this. It really shows you just how tricky this whole thing was.
I mean, check this out. The majority, with Justice Abad Santos, went with that whole segregation logic we just talked about, but then you have Justice Laurel, who agreed with the final decision, but for a totally different reason. He said Gold Creek's claim was an existing right that was actually protected by a special clause in the new Constitution. And then you had a powerful dissent from Justice Concepcion, who argued no, the right was incomplete, and so the new ban absolutely should apply.
And Justice Concepcion's argument was really sharp. He basically said, look, until Gold Creek actually pays the money, all they have is a mere privilege to purchase. They're not the owners yet. For him, ownership only happened at the very, very end, and since that hadn't happened yet, the new rules had to be followed.
So what's the big takeaway here? Why are we even talking about a mining dispute from the 1930s today?
Well, for Gold Creek, the outcome was huge. The court told the government to get on with it and process their patent. But the bigger legacy, the reason this case is so important, is that it established a core principle. Rights that you properly acquire under one set of rules can't just be vaporized when the rules change. It set a huge precedent for how to balance the power of the state with the private rights of individuals, especially when the laws are in flux. And in the end, the Gold Creek case leaves us with this really deep question, one that keeps coming up whenever there's big change. When a society decides to write a new rule book for its future, what exactly does it owe to the promises of its past?